and welcome to G220 Radio. My name is Mike, and this is probably going to be a disaster because I'm the ones running the whole thing, and when I run it, it's always a disaster. And with me is not the disaster, Natty P, who's always ready and prepared for a
Just
podcast.
that's because my job is to show up and I'm always here. There's nothing technical about that, I guess, but our calling card is technical difficulties, so
Yep.
we don't want
I
to mess with continuity.
So I watch a podcast on sometimes on disc golf, and they also do some live stuff.
Yeah.
And the guy who does kind of all the mixing, he once says his motto is a live stream will always have technical difficulties.
Yeah.
So there's always something going on, and so, but we are here, and we're going to be doing another episode in the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith on Christian freedom and liberty. So we get to talk about some liberties, some freedoms that we get as Christians. Benefits, privileges. I mean, just think about that there. We've been granted freedoms.
This should be an easy show for you, Mike, because didn't you go to Liberty?
I did. You know, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty.
Cool, man.
You laugh. That is the school's Bible verse.
Really? I mean, it's true, and it's a good verse, rightly understood, but it's just funny.
So, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's liberty. Funny. I don't know. I mean, liberty's changed since I've been there, so who knows? I mean, they're no more Calvinistic, but you know, it is what it is. So we are, like I said, jumping back into the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, chapter 21 on Christian liberty and the liberty of conscience. So we'll spend, hopefully, the next hour, and I say hopefully because we tend to go long, discussing 3 paragraphs. And as we noted, technical difficulties. I guess I can get a scene to show it so those of you on YouTube can read along with us. But we'll go ahead and kind of dive into it. Now, this is, correct me if I'm wrong, Nathaniel, this is chapter 20 in the Westminster.
Yeah, I forget which. Let me see if I can figure this out. I don't know if we have. I think chapter 20 is the one that throws us off. I don't know if we have that one in the Westminster.
Chapter 20 is not in the Westminster.
It was a good chapter in the Baptist, though.
So, yeah, it was a good chapter.
Yeah, so we also have the 4th paragraph added in the there's only 3 paragraphs in this one, and I believe the Savoy and the Westminster has 4 paragraphs. I think it has to do with something to do with reacting to ecclesiastical and civil totalitarianism or something like that. Or maybe this whole chapter was what that dealt with.
Yeah. It's always interesting to think through these, each of these confessions, because there is a part in which they reflect their culture, what they're dealing with.
Right.
You know, so we've talked about even on the Baptist side, how they're trying to show, look, we're within the historical tradition of the church. And so you add that in. So it is interesting, and there's probably somebody who's done work. We're not the first ones to notice it, on why exactly they don't add or take out, I guess, the fourth paragraph.
It's pertaining to like the civil magistrate and stuff. Let me see if I can pull it up here. So the legendary missing fourth paragraph is, I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about it now or when we get to it, but says, and because the powers which God hath ordained and the liberty which Christ hath purchased are not intended by God to destroy, but mutually uphold and preserve one another, they who upon pretense of Christian liberty shall oppose any lawful power or the lawful exercise of it, whether it be civil or ecclesiastical, resist the ordinance of God. And so it's basically has to do with those who would, upon the pretense of Christian liberty, like rebel against ecclesiastical authority, rightly administered, and also lawful civil orders, and talks about being punished by church censures and the civil magistrate for violations of each. So,
Okay.
I don't know if the Baptist proclivities.
That makes sense, because Baptists tend to, should I say, be Lone Rangers a little bit more.
Yeah.
So that makes sense with that. So here is chapter 1 or chapter 21, paragraph 1. It says, the liberty which Christ hath purchased for believers under the gospel consists in their freedom from guilt of sin and the condemnation wrath of God, the rigor and course of the law, and their being delivered from this present evil world, bondage to sin, dominion from sin, from the evil of afflictions, the fear and sting of death, the victory of the grave, and the everlasting damnation. As also in their free access to God and yielding obedience unto him, and not from slavish fear, but a childlike love and a willing mind. I'll stop there on that aspect. So when we look at that and think kind of with it, what are some of the big points that jump out for you when we look at this kind of first paragraph within paragraph 1?
Well, the big thing that really jumps out immediately, and it should because it's within the first clause, is the liberty which Christ has purchased for believers under the gospel. So like a lot of times when Christian liberty discussions, it's we talk about, what am I free to do? What am I allowed to do now? Yeah, and X, Y, and Z. What can you not tell me not to do because I have Christian liberty? And it's really just it's like a cheap freedom. And really, what the fundamental aspect of Christian liberty is, it's a liberty that's been granted to you, that's been fought and won by Jesus, and is purchased by the infinitely precious blood of Jesus. That's the first thing that jumps out at me.
Yeah, I think you see kind of two aspects when we look at what it's saying. There's a freedom from our sin,
right,
and the works that are required for us to be righteous before God, and then also the freedom from the curses that accompany our sin. I think it's as we kind of go through this, I think it's we shouldn't skip over it. I think this lays kind of the foundation for kind of understanding the ideas of, can I get a tattoo? How much should I give to the
Right.
church? And some of these other questions. Can I eat meat sacrificed to idols? I think having this understanding of what we have been freed from and then also freed to
Right.
with it, because you have the liberty consist so it's liberty consist in their freedom. That's kind of the sentence, and it's the liberty which Christ has purchased for believers under the gospel. And we've already kind of worked our way through all those other chapters in kind of formatting the different aspects of the gospel. In fact, the previous chapter talks about the gospel. It's added here in the in the London Baptist. And so coming off of the heel of that, now we have this purchase. Now look what Christ has freed us from, and the liberty we now have to, as it mentions, we have now freedom to access God, to yield obedience unto him, not out of a slavish fear, but a childlike love and a willing mind. And when we think about what that means, I think it transfers the question. Kind of what we see is, a lot of times you mention it, it's how far can we get to that line and not sin?
Right.
But it rephrases the question and goes, well, will this be glorifying to God? I think
Right.
that's the important, the better question. It's not how far is my freedom, but will this glorify God in the end?
Yeah, I mean that's a really big deal because I've heard it said that true freedom is not freedom to do what you want, but freedom to do what you ought, or maybe we could even say freedom to want to do what you ought. Um, and that's like when you think about it, before you're saved, before you're justified and adopted and sanctified, you are a slave to sin. Like you don't have any freedom to not sin. Like a necessary consequence of you living is sinning, and you really don't have any power over it, because you're a sinner, so you sin. However, in this liberty, setting free from even the dominion of sin, which is that ruling and reigning power of sin in the life of the unregenerate person, um, and also the bondage to Satan, where it says you're held captive by him to do his will, and so now you are free from those enslaving things. That's like always a good question to ask. You want to ask, what were you enslaved to? If you're free, what are you free from? And it's just always good to think deeply, and that's what we're free from. And then, like you said, freed to obedience to God, which is that's true freedom, because you're designed for obedience for God and designed to glorify him. So whenever you have Christian liberty, firstly, you're liberated to fulfill your design. That's so that's that aspect of it. And I mean, that's really how all of the epistles of Paul are set up. You have, in the same way, you have, what are you freed from? You're freed from sin, God's wrath, and you're freed to, the second half of every Pauline epistle is the imperatives. You start with the indicative, what you've been freed from, and then what you've been commanded to be freed to, and what you're now allowed to do. And it's goes from fear of law breaking to joy of law keeping. Exciting stuff.
Yeah. And I think that's important. I'm always reminded in this time, and I know I've shared this, just Augustine's understanding of love. So he's trying to respond. This is in his letter called The Spirit and the Letter. And he's responding to Pelagius about like freedom, true freedom, and true love. What does true love look like? And he he gives an example using a, a kid, a child, and his mother, her mother, and asks which one is true love. The one who the mother tells him to do something and he completely rebels. The um the one where she tells him to do something, he does it, but does it begrudgingly. Or the one who, when the mother says to do something, does it happily. And to look at it in that, and to see it in the frame, like, well, which one has kind of the true obedience and the freedom? Well, the other two, the first two, are trapped in their sin. They're not enjoying their life. They're not doing what they're supposed to, and in the end, they're gonna receive some sort of consequence of it. But the one who obeys his mother joyfully is the one who ultimately has true freedom, and in one sense is the only one who does true obedience. And to understand then the freedom we have is a freedom to enjoy God in complete and childlike love and obedience, and to then find our fulfillment in doing what is righteous, doing what is holy, and pursuing holiness, because we know that's what God loves. God, who is holy, loves people who are holy. And since we are unholy people, he has purchased us through Christ under the gospel. And so that we can now live in this holy obedience through the power of his Spirit.
Right. And I mean, even just the freedom for it to be joyful, where you have that condemnation of the law, the curse of the law, the severity and the curse of the law, is like the middle child doing it begrudgingly, is doing it because the law is severe, and if he doesn't obey mom when dad gets home, it's going to be a bad story for him. And so that's he's not enjoying himself, and he's not really free, because he has to make a choice to not get punished and hope that he does the entirety of the thing so that he, you know what I mean? And so he's not really, the way you mentioned it, the joyfulness of the third child is doing what he wants to do and doing what's pleasing to God. Whereas the middle child, who's outward obedience and inward hostility, is doing not what he wants to do, and also not, he's not doing what he wants to do, so he's not free.
Yeah.
And even the rapscallion, who rebelled completely, he still has what we saw earlier, the curse, the condemning wrath of the father when he gets home, and also the guilt of his guilty conscience as he rebelled against his mom, knowing that he's going to be found out. So he's not free either, because even though he did what he wanted, he's not enjoying what he wanted. So the only one with even true liberty is the one who wanted to please mom.
Yeah. I think, and that's important to think about even in our Christian, I mean, obviously it's a greater to less than a greater argument. This is how it is in a family, how much more is it when we consider the God, the just God of all the universe, who has so lavishly given us the grace to be saved. I think, and that's so then to think of it, Christian liberty is founded upon the gospel teaching. And so when we continue on, even to finish out this paragraph, says all which were common also to believers under the law for the substance of them, but in the New Testament the liberty of Christians is further enlarged, and their freedom from the yoke of the ceremonial law to which the Jewish church were subjected, and in greater boldness of access to the throne of grace, and in fuller communication of the free Spirit of God than believers under the law did ordinarily partake of. I think when we think about, what's there, how much more freedom we have compared to the Old Testament saints. We can say with the author of Hebrews, boldly approach the throne of grace, where you don't boldly approach the Holy of Holies.
No.
You're going to get struck down. And even the high priest, who's allowed to go in once a time, if he goes in unholy and he has to go in twice in one day, he's not going to make it. And, we shouldn't abuse this kind of liberty to think about, what God has given to us as New Testament believers.
Right. Yeah, we wouldn't want to misconstrue it. The Old Testament church did indeed have freedom from the guilt of sin, freedom from the condemning wrath of God, to a degree, a lesser degree, the severity of the curse, and all the other attendant things that are mentioned. But the fullness of the access wasn't there, like you're saying. So Jesus says in John 4. There will come a time when you neither worship on this mountain or that mountain, but in spirit and in truth. And so you are free in a different way, in a fuller way, because you don't have to go to Jerusalem for Yom Kippur. You don't have to go to Jerusalem for the booths. You don't have to take an animal in order to commune rightly with God. You now, in a fuller way, can commune with him at any time because of the finished sacrifice. So we have a fuller communication with different standard operating procedures, and that yoke that was enacted to teach the Old Testament saints of the coming Messiah and remind them of the one to come, as he has now come. And so we have that fuller access and bigger freedom.
Yeah, and we've already talked about the law. It was in a previous chapter, so go back and listen to it, because it
Right.
plays into how we think about it. And I think you're right. This second paragraph doesn't neglect the first one for the Old Testament saints.
Right.
Just acknowledge that they had specific rules they needed to do in order to be clean and to be able to approach God. And that all of those are symbols to what God was going to do with Christ on the cross. But it doesn't neglect the fact that they couldn't. Like, even Abraham just couldn't come to God.
Right.
There is something different. We have the prophecies, Micah 2. You see it in Acts 2, where now the Spirit is being poured out on believers. This is not something that was given in the Old Testament. It was given mostly to prophets and kings. When we consider it, and look at the text. And it can be given and taken away. King Saul had the Spirit of God upon him, and it was removed for him, given upon David, who would later become king. And so when we think about just that God has given us freedoms that past believers didn't have, the Old Testament saints didn't have. And you see this even in Paul's writing when he talks about the Gentiles being grafted into the tree, into the promises of Israel. And you have it, but there's a warning there that as much as you've been grafted in, God can take you out. And to then think about not only our Jewish brethren who at this time, I mean, it's a weird transition with it, and still trying to, in a sense, maintain their cleanliness according to the standards of their families. And I think you see that, and even in Peter's own life, especially with eating with Gentiles, you see the rebuke that Paul gives him, talks about in Galatians. We see him going into Gentiles' homes, kind of starting in Acts. All of those were not allowed, and now they have the freedom, apart from the law, to go into Gentiles' homes.
Right.
To see the Spirit descend on the Gentiles and have them be transformed into fellow children of God.
Right.
So paragraph 2 here in chapter 21. Let's see. Here it is. Says, God alone is Lord of the conscience, and hath left it free from the doctrines and commandments of men, which are in anything contrary to his word, or not contained in it. So that to believe such doctrines or to obey such commands out of conscience is to betray true liberty and conscience, and required of an implicit faith, an absolute and blind obedience. It is to destroy liberty of conscience and reason also. So what are kind of the main thing you pulled out of paragraph 2 here?
So this paragraph really begins with God. God is the one who is supposed to determine how our consciences feel. You know, we're all given as image bearers of God a conscience, which is the moral law written on our conscience. You know, and this moral law on our conscience is touched by those same effects of the fall as every other member we possess. And so at various times, obviously, there are those who would come in and bind your conscience with various things that are contrary to the word. And so that's what it says. God is the Lord of the conscience. And so your conscience needs to be calibrated by what God says, that being the things that are in his word, it required or prohibited in his word, rather than things that people would foist on you that are contrary to the word or not even touched on in it. And then I think it really concludes by saying that if you allow your conscience to be bound in this way, so you got to wear a tie to church. That's not even a rule at your church, but you say, my conscience will not allow me to not wear a tie at church. Well, you're really not using liberty of conscience, because there's nowhere in the Bible that says, at least, that says you need to wear a tie to church. Now there may
Or
be
your
other,
Sunday best.
yeah, yeah, there may be wisdom principles that you don't want to come stinking, but um, whenever you bind yourself on with these things, you're not, choosing to exercise your conscience, your liberty. You're not exercising your Christian liberty by saying, "Well, I got to wear a tie to church." What you're really saying, what you're really doing is you're betraying it. You're putting yourself under a yoke of bondage, which God has not commanded and didn't even enter his mind.
Yeah, I think to think through it is either you have commands and wisdom from God that
Right,
come out as either explicit or through reason.
right,
And to add upon that is to add laws that God has not commanded. And, you think about, I'll use Mormonism for an example. But you see this in other, and even Baptist churches. When you visit the Mormon temple, you have to wear a suit. You will not be allowed to just walk in to the temple without a suit on. As you mentioned, where does it say you have to wear a suit to go to the house of the Lord? Or wear your Sunday best, however you want to define that. Now, is there good reasons to maybe dress nicer for church? Is it possibly just a cultural thing that we do? That is a separate clothes. It's not what we work in for the most part, especially in skilled labor jobs. Like, is there something about it? And that's there, but that is not a commandment to dress a certain way for church. And so when we think about kind of what this means, is that we need to follow Christ. We need to follow what the Bible has said to us. And when we don't, we're adding a yoke, and we're, in a sense, as it mentions, destroying our liberty. We're not free anymore. We are, in a sense, reversing what God has already done. He has removed our guilt, but now we're adding these rules that we must have. The Old Testament saints had a yoke of the ceremonial laws. We are now adding a new yoke on ourselves in that way. And I think that's when we think about it in that way, and that when we hold to doctrines not rooted in Scripture, when we hold to commands not came out with good and necessary reasons or is explicitly said, we, in a sense, put that yoke on. And how many times, you've seen it on the street, I've experienced it on the street, you're talking to someone and it's you kind of that, let's say it, work righteousness that comes from it.
right.
You hear, "Oh, I did all those things."
Yeah.
There's as if there's one sense, a lot of times what they're saying are good in things and we should be doing them. But they've added this yoke upon themselves in which the gospel has released us from.
Right.
And, or we talk about how dangerous false doctrines are.
Right.
And how they play out. That destroys our liberty of conscience. And then, so when we think about it, and then, just kind of the biggest example in church history, we celebrate it, those who us in the Reformed tradition, every, October 31st, it comes up. And the Diet of Worms, it is one of the final days of this council. 2 days prior, a monk named Martin Luther is there. He has to take time to think about recanting what he has wrote. And he stands up and goes, I can't. I'm not going to recant because it would go against my conscience. And he was fighting against the false doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church. And we see in that example just how, the Catholic Church is filled with immoralities and manipulating the people for their ends.
Right.
I think, and to just kind of see the yoke put upon them. And that's what happens when we believe doctrines and commandments of men.
Right. It always starts off with the like the Pharisees were so zealous, or maybe the Pharisees, scribes, Sadducees, the people Jesus was running in with. We're very zealous about law keeping, and so in order to protect the law, they added other laws, and it came down through their really, I don't know if it was the Talmud,
Mishnah.
the Mishnah.
I don't know. It's either Talmud or Mishnah. I get it mixed up. But yeah.
All their various extraneous commentaries on the Bible, they added fences. And so rather than being a fence to keep me away from breaking the law, it turns into a law into itself. And you're binding these things on for justification purposes, basically where you distort these as a way of attaining God's favor through these various law keeping practices, whether it's salvific favor or even just favor to get what you want out of God, and adding on these commandments that aren't required. Like, God doesn't command it, and if God doesn't command it, you don't have to do it. And if whether it's a good thing to do or not, if you start treating it as though it is required for salvation, justification, or any other sort of blessing from God, then that's when it becomes sinister. When good things become sinister, it's nice to dress nice. It lets people that are lets people know that you're serious. You take yourself seriously as a man. It lets people know that you care about them because you want to dress nice for them, and lets them know that you take God seriously because you're dressing up to come to the house of the Lord. But for this to be something that you do because God's not going to bless you, or I'm not going to feel justified, or any number of things, or you have to do it, or you're not a real, truly reformed Christian, it's where you go wrong. It's nice to dress nice, but it ain't that nice. And do that with any number of things that have the appearance of godliness, but really have no power to restrain the indulgences of the flesh. Do that with any number of things. Don't have to be dressing nice. It's a simple example. There's popish commandments and all kinds of other stuff you could throw into that same category that are not commanded by God, and people turn into tie them so closely to God's favor, and you're freer than that.
Yeah, I think it leads into kind of what you're talking about here in um, paragraph 3.
Right.
There at the bottom on the screen, it says, they who upon the pretense of Christian liberty do practice any sin or cherish any sinful lust, as they do thereby prevent the main design of grace of the gospel to their own destruction, so they are wholly destroyed to the end of Christian liberty, which is that being delivered out of the hands of all of our enemies, we might serve the Lord without fear in holiness and righteousness before him and all the days of our lives. And to think about, I mean, we mentioned it earlier, we can kind of think about Christian liberty as two ways. How far can I get without sinning?
Right.
Or how does my actions glorify God? I think you see here where that first question is wrongly understood.
Right.
Because in a sense of, when we ask the question, how far can I go without sinning? We're trying to use the Christian life and Christian liberty as a way to kind of furnish maybe leftover feelings of sin. And to, like, I know this is wrong, but is this wrong? And to still, I mean, there's a sense in which there's that allurement of sin,
right,
that they want. But in the same thing, this paragraph clearly says, as Paul does, that we just can't go on sinning and let sin abound because grace abounds.
Right.
That to use the pretense of Christian liberty to practice sin brings us our own destruction, because we still doing the thing that Christ has saved us from.
Right.
And which we know God hates. And so, even, those who reject Calvinism and says that Calvinism allows people to practice sinning and kind of more attached to the idea of once saved, always saved mentality. Though here at G220, we reject that terminology for the better perseverance of the saints. But when you get in that mentality of once save, always save, logically it makes sense. Well, I can do whatever I want. I'm already saved. And I think that's where the warning passages in Hebrews helps us out to consider, right. Are you the one who kind of forsakes what God has done? And I think that's to understand it, which makes the importance of how can I serve God? What can I do to serve the Lord without fear and in holiness and righteousness before him? Instead
right.
of, well, can I get away with this sin? Or because I've been saved and Christ has paid for my sins, therefore I can do whatever I want.
Right. Yeah. And this is that cheap grace that Bonhoeffer talks about, or we talked about at the very beginning of the show, that costly liberty which Christ has purchased for us in the gospel. It's acting like shifting the focus on us, where we are the chief end of the gospel rather than God's glory, and treating it cheaply, like it didn't cost anybody anything, and so it's free. It's the work of Christ on the cross is something to be trampled on and contemned, is what's happening here. I've taken the focus off of God and His glory. How may I please Him? And turned it on myself. What's the maximum that I can get away with to please myself? It's really a warped focus. It's taking the focus off God and placing it on man. And this is a reaction to. So basically, what we have in paragraph 2 is a reaction against the ecclesiastical totalitarianism of the day, that being the papacy rebelling, or I shouldn't say rebelling, but setting straight the abuses of the ecclesiastical totalitarianism, whether we're talking about the Catholics back then, or your independent fundamentalists, or truly reformed today. That's setting straight in paragraph 2. And then this one, we're setting straight those who, seeing the abuses of paragraph 2, would run so far in the other direction into licentiousness. And this is having to pull them back and be like, no, you're falling into the same ditch of destroying your liberty, because as you've said, you've already been set free from this. So really 2 and 3, both men in 2 and 3 are both falling into they're not two ditches on the opposite sides of the road. They're the same ditch. One destroys Christian liberty by tying stuff onto himself that he doesn't have to do because he's been set free from. And then the one in 3 ties back on his sins that he's already set free from. So paragraph 2 and 3 are two men in the same ditch who both fell there through different stumbling blocks.
Yeah. Or you could say there are two ends of the paradigm, the pendulum swing, two extremes. First is kind of a legalism, right, and the second is antinomianism. When you right. really get down into it, it's living without the law, or disregard to the law. So anti, and then nomianism is law in Greek. So without the law, or against the law. And so, yeah, you kind of hit it. Either, so you have legalism on one side, kind of, which destroys your liberty of conscience. The other side does too, because you're not living out the freedom which God has given to you in a way that's honoring to Him, like a judge pardoning someone for doing something wrong, and the guy turns around and does the same thing again and gets caught. Yeah. Kind of this disregard, and the antinomianism. And I think that's, to think about it, that yes, as Christians, we're not under the law. We already saw that, but that doesn't mean we don't obey the law. And that the law is good. It is a delight. And those who are blessed are those who meditate on the law. And so you don't want to add more laws than what God has given. So the one rejection, but then you just don't want to get rid of the laws, because that's how God has told us to honor Him and to worship Him. And that's why we go through the Proverbs and we see the wisdom that God has given to us, built upon the moral understandings and the moral laws that He has given everyone in their conscience to obey them. And you look at it, it perverts the main design of the grace, the gospel, when we disregard that we continue to sin in what we've been saved from, because we have been delivered out of it, and that we're made to serve God. And this has been something that is a constant fight in everyone, like even not just on the grand scheme of the church altogether, but even in our own lives. Mm-hmm. There's probably times that we run the whole gamut between this, where we are legalistic in this side, but we're antinomian on this. And then there's some that hopefully, as we learn, the pendulum swing isn't as chaotic um, in it. But I think when we think about this chapter and when we apply it to our own lives, when we start thinking about, well, can I get a tattoo? Is it a sin to get a tattoo? Well, we see in I think it's Leviticus. I don't remember the thing about not tattooing yourself. But when we understand the verse, it seems to have some religious aspect that the pagans would do in order to please their gods. We see that the Mount Carmel before the fire from heaven comes down and devours the sacrifice Elijah built up. They're saying they're cutting themselves. And to understand that. So does that mean a Christian shouldn't get a tattoo? At least it's not. There's freedom for them to do that. Now, there may be other questions
Right.
that should be asked before you do it. Like, will it glorify God? Is it maybe the right use of my money? And some other questions that will help you to decide. But I think when we start thinking about, is there a command that explicitly says no? Okay, if it says that so this would be a command, a negative command. It says that you can't do it. We have to ask other questions. That brings in wisdom. What would be the best? Now you have the positive commands, like love one another. Again, those are questions that you have to do and play a part with those other questions. And that's when the discussion of the younger and weaker brother come in. I may have the right to get a tattoo, and I may even think it's okay, and that I really like this tattoo and I want it. This is not real life. This is situational. But I may be in a church that kind of frowns upon it. They may even be kind of, maybe in the second paragraph, maybe a little legalistic about it. Well, that's where this idea of the stronger and weaker brother comes in. And to understand that while I may have the freedom to get a tattoo, it may be best for me to give up my freedom in order to serve the others and to help them and to teach them and to be part of it. We can think about this probably with alcohol or kind of any other of these sins that traditionally conservative Christians have said not to do, like the Baptist dancing. Is it okay to dance? I mean, David danced before the Lord. So these types of questions, what this helps us is to understand, okay, there are commandments. We need to look at the commandments. We're not to just disregard commandments, but we need to make sure we're being wise with what we're doing so that we can serve the Lord with fear and holiness and righteousness before him all the days of our lives.
Right. Well said.
So, and I think that's important, you know.
So,
there it is.
so what? Just one final question. What do we do with the weaker brother? Is there our goal to just let them do according to their conscience? Maybe they're in paragraph 2 and 3. Are we just to let them continue to be the weaker brother? What do we do whenever we're working with a weaker brother?
So, I think I'm trying to remember the passages. I think part of it is there's a sense in which we are called to, while we give up our freedom, we're also called to help them to see their freedom.
Right.
And I think there's ways to do that. There's praying for them, that God would teach them, open their eyes, maybe even use conversations to consider that. And again, but I'm not to like lord this freedom over them either. And I think, and that's the balance. I had a conversation with an acquaintance. I worked with his wife, but he would show up and we would talk. And he was kind of upset that at Southern Seminary, you're not allowed to drink alcohol while you're a student. That includes in between the terms. And so Southern Baptist, it makes sense, kind of a lot of teetotalers, good and bad in that sense, and with it. So that's a rule that's in the covenant that you sign every semester. And he was frustrated with it. He's, at least at the time we were talking about, he kind of turned, but he challenged it because my wife and I have made the commitment that we would not be ones who drink alcohol, whether knowing that we have the freedom. So just putting it out there, we know we have the freedom. We made the choice to not do it when we don't hold that to anyone else. And we have our reasons for it. But at the time, by obligation, I have to. I'm a student at Southern Seminary. I've signed the contract. I have kind of this institution, whether right or wrong, that's the rule. And he plainly asked me, he goes, so you wouldn't drink alcohol even in your home anywhere, like without them? I was like, yeah. Because if I wanted to, because I don't want them to stumble. That's the idea Paul gives us. So we don't lord our freedom over them lest they stumble. But we're also called to build them up. We're called to spur them on to love and good works. And to teach them and hope that while they may choose not to do what you do, they don't stumble upon it. They see the freedom with it. I think that's how we work through this. It's understanding, I know I have the freedom. I have the freedom to do it, and I also have the freedom to give it up. And there may be times that I use my freedom to give something up in order to encourage and admonish a brother so that they can see the greater freedom they have. And to love them in a way that builds them in that way. Again, it's not looking after me. And Paul talks about this when you use in 1 Corinthians 10 about the eating sacrifice meat. We know it's nothing. But some people still have conscious issues. And even today, some people still may have conscious issues about eating meat that are sacrificed to idols. And there's part of it which you shouldn't go out to try to have your conscience kind of hurt with it. I think you have that there. But then there's also, Paul says, I know it's just that meat, but for sake of others, I don't do it. I don't eat meat sacrificed for idols. And I think that's how you do it. And that shows out in the expression of love towards your neighbor and how that works out. So if someone boycotts Starbucks for liberal things, I'm not going to take them to Starbucks. If they do it. Now, I have other reasons why not to take them to Starbucks too. But that way. And we do have to watch, this is getting kind of off topics with that. But, just understanding our brothers and what we can and can't do, with them. I think and that's just shows up. So, having a good understanding of our freedom allows us to kind of, as Paul says, be to all people, that we can do things in a way and navigate in the world that's honoring to God and yet still be able to have it. So yeah, that's kind of how I developed a thought and to think through dealing with those issues. Because I do have people in my life that are maybe more strict on what should and should not be done by a Christian. And I don't hold the same views. And, how would I navigate that? Well, I don't want to offend people unnecessarily. We kind of talk it. Now, there's still the chance to be offended, and that's when you just pray that God would show them their error or to show that you're wrong. I think there's also the other side. As we work together to find truth. And never assume you're always the stronger man. Don't do that. Be willing to search the scriptures and see. So, any final words?
I don't know. That was just be free. That's my final word, I guess.
Yeah.
For freedom's sake, Christ set us free.
Christ has set us free. So, this has been episode number 462. Talk about Christian freedom from the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, chapter 20, because all of us are Baptists at heart.
Comprehensive Baptist.
Just kidding. We thank you for joining us for this episode. Join us next week. We'll have an episode before Christmas. It'll be exciting. We only have 2 episodes left of the 2020 season.
Man.
It's been a wild 50 weeks. And so, but yeah. So join us next week, 9 p.m. Eastern on YouTube if you want to catch the live recording. You can always catch audio versions on Podbean. So you can go over there. If you have a suggestion for a show you want us to do, go ahead and send us an email at G220Radio@gmail.com. You can send it to us on Facebook too. And if you want more content like this, do what everyone else told you to do. Like and subscribe. Woohoo. Get all fancy now. So, for Ricky, who was not able to be with us today, Nathaniel, who's co-hosting with me, I am Mike. Thank you for listening to G220 Radio. We'll catch you next time. God bless.